I'm Martha Stewart, 82, a woman, and I was told by my son's girlfriend to get out of my own home. Not a place I was renting, not a guest room I was borrowing. My home. The one my late husband, James, and I built with our own four hands, the house where I raised my only child, the sanctuary that holds every significant memory of my life. To be told I was a bother in my own home, a piece of old furniture that needed to be moved to a dusty room in a facility somewhere, was a cruelty I never thought I'd have to face, especially not with my own son standing right there watching it happen. The house stands on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood that has aged with me. The oak tree James planted in the front yard the day our son Marcus was born is now a giant, its branches stretching over the roof like protective arms. Inside, the floorboards have a particular creak that I know like the sound of my own breathing. Every faded spot on the wallpaper, every chip in the porcelain sink tells a story. This wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was the bedrock of my existence, the container for my legacy. My son Marcus was the center of that legacy. When he was a boy, he was my shadow, a sweet, gentle child with wide, curious eyes who believed I could fix anything from a scraped knee to a broken toy. James, my husband, was a strong, practical man, a carpenter by trade, and he always worried that we were too soft on Marcus. Martha, he would say, his voice a low, gentle rumble, the boy has a good heart, but it's a soft heart. The world eats soft hearts for breakfast. I would just smile and wave it away. I saw his kindness as a strength, not a weakness. I see now that James saw a malleability in him that I was blind to. He saw a boy who would bend to the will of the last person who spoke to him, a trait that would curdle into passivity as he grew into a man. There were signs, of course. I just chose to interpret them through a mother's loving gaze. When Marcus was in his 20s, he got involved in a get-rich-quick scheme with a friend. He invested thousands of dollars from his savings, money he had worked hard for at his first real job. James and I told him it sounded too good to be true. Marcus was defensive, saying we didn't believe in him. "You just want me to work a hammer and nails like Dad," he'd said, his words stinging James more than he let on. A few months later, the scheme collapsed and Marcus lost everything. He came to us ashamed and broken. James wanted to let him learn the hard way to build himself back up, but I couldn't bear to see him suffer. I took money from our own savings, the rainy day fund James so meticulously kept, and gave it to him to get back on his feet. Marcus was grateful, of course. He hugged me tightly and promised he'd pay me back. He never did. James just shook his head and said, "You're not helping him, Martha. You're teaching him that the net will always appear." Years later, after James had passed, Marcus married his first wife. She was a perfectly nice woman, but she found Marcus's lack of ambition frustrating. They argued, and Marcus would often call me to complain. I would listen, a sympathetic ear, but I always urged him to stand up for himself, to be a partner, to meet her halfway. But he wouldn't. He just wanted to be told he was right. He wanted me to fix it. Their marriage ended after 5 years, and once again, Marcus was adrift. He was in his late 40s then, a man lost, and my heart ached for him. It was a pattern I should have recognized. Marcus would hit a wall, and I would become the wall he leaned on until he felt steady again. So when he called me 6 months ago, his voice thick with a familiar blend of shame and desperation, I knew what was coming. At 54 years old, he had been laid off from his sales manager position. His apartment was too expensive, and he had nowhere to go. "Ma," he said, his voice small, can I just come home for a little while, just until I get back on my feet?" What mother could say no? My home was large and quiet, my days filled with gardening, reading, and the gentle rhythm of solitude. The thought of having my son back under my roof, even under these circumstances, sparked a flicker of warmth in me. "Of course, sweetheart," I said without hesitation. "Your room is just how you left it." The net, as James would have said, had appeared once again, but I had no idea that this time Marcus wasn't just bringing himself. He was bringing the person who would try to cut that net to pieces with me still in it. The first few weeks were pleasant enough. Marcus moved back into his childhood bedroom, and we fell into a comfortable, if somewhat altered, routine. I would make coffee in the morning, and we would sit at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a boy. He seemed humbled, quieter. He spent his days on the laptop, searching for jobs, and I was proud of his diligence. I felt like I was doing what a mother should do, providing a safe harbor in a storm. I was happy to have him, to cook for him, to feel the house filled with more than just my own quiet movements. The silence I had grown accustomed to since James's passing was a peaceful one, but it was still silence. Marcus's presence was a welcome disruption. About a month into his stay, he brought up a name I'd never heard before, Tiffany. Ma, there's someone I'd like you to meet, he said one evening, a nervous energy about him I hadn't seen in years. Her name is Tiffany Monroe. We've been seeing each other for a little while. She's really special. I was thrilled for him. A new romance could be just the thing to lift his spirits. Well, of course, Marcus. Bring her over for dinner on Sunday. The Sunday she arrived, the first thing that struck me was the sheer volume of her presence. Tiffany was not a quiet person. She was 32, 22 years younger than Marcus, with a loud laugh, a cloud of expensive, cloying perfume, and a way of talking that was more like a performance. She was beautiful, I couldn't deny that, with flawless skin and a figure she showcased in a tight, brightly colored dress. She swept into my home, kissed the air near my cheek, and exclaimed, "Oh my God, this house is just darling. It's got such vintage charm." I wasn't sure if vintage charm was a compliment or a euphemism for old. I served the roast chicken I had spent all afternoon preparing, a recipe James had loved. Tiffany poked at it. "I'm mostly plant-based these days," she announced to the table, "but I'll make an exception for you, Martha, this one time." Throughout dinner, she dominated the conversation, talking about her job as a social media influencer, a concept I didn't fully grasp, and her plans for the future. Marcus just watched her, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration. He was like a boy with his first crush, hanging on her every word, laughing a little too loudly at her jokes. I tried to engage her, to ask about her family, her upbringing. She gave vague, dismissive answers, quickly turning the conversation back to herself. A week later, Marcus approached me again, shuffling his feet like a teenager asking for the car keys. "Ma, Tiffany's lease is up at the end of the month and she's in a bit of a tight spot. Would it be okay if she stayed here for just a little bit? Just a few weeks until we find our own place? It would help us save up a deposit." A red flag went up, a small, quiet warning bell in the back of my mind. It was happening so fast, but I looked at my son's hopeful, pleading face and I saw the man who was struggling, who had finally found a spark of happiness. How could I extinguish it? I thought of what James would say about being a doormat, about the slippery slope of favors, but James was gone and my son was here. "All right, Marcus," I sighed, pushing my misgivings aside. "A few weeks, but you'll have to respect that this is my home with my rules." "Of course, Ma, she will. You'll see, she's wonderful." The day Tiffany moved in, she didn't arrive with a few suitcases. She arrived with a moving van. Boxes labeled kitchen, living room, Tiffany's closet were stacked in my hallway. It seemed like an entire apartment's worth of belongings. She directed the movers with the authority of a general, pointing to spaces in my living room, my dining room, as if they were empty lots waiting for her development. "This hideous old lamp has to go," she declared, pointing at the Tiffany-style lamp. The irony was not lost on me that James and I had bought on our 25th anniversary. Before I could protest, she had a mover unplug it and shove it toward a corner. In its place, she put a sleek chrome monstrosity that bathed the warm, cozy room in a cold, sterile light. That was only the beginning. My home, once a reflection of a life lovingly built, was becoming a foreign territory. The few weeks began to stretch into a month, then two. Tiffany did not find a job. Marcus's job search seemed to slow down, replaced by evenings out with Tiffany and her friends, an endless parade of young, loud people who treated my home like a public lounge. They'd arrive without warning, their booming music vibrating through the floorboards, leaving empty glasses and pizza boxes in their wake. I would retreat to my bedroom, the thumping bass a hostile intruder in the quiet sanctuary of my grief for James. I tried to set boundaries. "Tiffany, dear," I said one morning, trying to keep my voice gentle as I picked up a wine-stained coaster from my polished mahogany side table. "Could you please ask your friends to be a bit more considerate? This is a quiet neighborhood." She looked up from her phone, her expression one of mild annoyance. "Martha, you need to loosen up. It's just a bit of fun. We're not hurting anyone." She didn't call me Mrs. Stewart or even Martha. It was always just Martha, prawn. ounced with a slight, almost imperceptible sigh as if my name was an effort to say. She began to subtly colonize the house. My spice rack was reorganized according to some system only she understood, making it impossible for me to find the paprika. My favorite armchair, the one with the perfect indentation from years of me sitting there reading, was moved to the sunroom because it clashed with the new aesthetic. The new aesthetic was apparently a collection of her own cushions, throws, and art prints that she'd hung on my walls without asking. My kitchen became her personal studio. She would spend hours creating content, filming herself making smoothies with ingredients I'd never heard of, leaving a trail of powder and discarded vegetable peels on my counters. "This is for my brand," she'd explain, as if that sanctified the mess. The most painful part was Marcus's complicity. He saw what was happening, but he refused to intervene. When I tried to talk to him, he would get defensive. "Ma, you're exaggerating. Tiffany's just trying to make the place feel a little more like home for herself, too." "But it's not her home, Marcus," I said, my voice trembling with a frustration I could no longer contain. "It's my home, she is a guest here." "Don't be like that," he'd mumble, avoiding my eyes. "She loves you, she's just got a different way of showing it." Love, it felt like an invasion. It felt like I was being systematically erased from my own life. The final vestiges of James, the quiet order he and I had built, were being painted over with Tiffany's garish colors. I started eating my meals in my room just to avoid the tension, to avoid the sight of her sitting in James's chair at the head of the dining table, a place no one but him had ever occupied. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen humming to myself and preparing to bake a lemon drizzle cake, my mother's recipe. It was a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim a piece of my kitchen. Tiffany walked in, dressed for a workout, and surveyed my layout of flour, sugar, and butter with a disdainful look. "You're making that again?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You know how much sugar is in that stuff? It's literally poison." I felt a hot flash of anger. This was my mother's recipe, and I have been enjoying it for 82 years. I think I'll survive. She rolled her eyes and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Look, Martha," she began, her voice taking on a tone of practiced, false sincerity. "Marcus and I have been talking, and we feel like this arrangement isn't really working anymore." I stopped, my hand frozen over the bowl of flour. I looked past her toward the doorway and saw Marcus standing there, leaning against the frame, his gaze fixed on the floor. He wouldn't look at me. "What arrangement?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "This whole thing," Tiffany said, waving her hand around the kitchen at me, at my entire life. "You hear us here, it's crowded, we don't have any privacy. We can't really start our life together with you, well, with you always around." The air left my lungs. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "What are you saying, Tiffany?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself to deliver a difficult but necessary truth. "We think it's time you started looking at other options. You know, for your own good, there are some really lovely senior apartments downtown. They have activities and nurses on staff. You wouldn't have to worry about this big old house all by yourself. It's a burden." A burden, my home was a burden, I was a burden. I stared at her, speechless, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity, the breathtaking cruelty of her words. And then I looked at my son. My son Marcus, he was still just standing there, his face a mask of discomfort, but his silence was a roar. His silence was his consent. He was letting this happen. He was letting this stranger, this woman he'd known for a few months, stand in my kitchen and tell me to get out of the home I had built over 50 years. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice cracking, "is this what you want?" He finally lifted his head, but his eyes only darted to mine for a second before flitting away. "Ma," he said, his voice weak and thin, "she's just thinking of you. It's getting to be a lot for you to handle." "Is it?" I asked, the chill in my heart turning to ice. "Or is it just getting to be in your way?" Tiffany stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's arm as if to steady him. "We just need our own space," she said, her voice softening into a manipulative purr. "We want to be able to live our lives. You're bothering us. Find another apartment." You're bothering us. The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering and deadly. They severed the last thread of hope I had that my son would ever be the man his father and I had tried to raise. In that moment, he wasn't my child. He was her accomplice, and I was no longer a mother in her own home. I was an obstacle. I didn't say another word. I turned away from them, from the half-made cake on the counter, from the pity in Tiffany's eyes and the shame on my son's face. I walked out of the kitchen, each step feeling heavy and deliberate. I walked up the stairs, my hand gripping the familiar smooth wood of the banister for support. I went into my bedroom and closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like a vault sealing me in. The first few days were a blur of numb disbelief. I stayed in my room, emerging only late at night to get a glass of water or a piece of toast when I knew they would be asleep or out. The house, my house, no longer felt safe. The cheerful creak of the floorboards now sounded like a groan of sorrow. The familiar scent of old wood and lemon polish was choked out by the lingering aroma of Tiffany's perfume. I felt like a ghost, haunting the periphery of my own existence. I was a tenant in my own life story. The heartbreak was a physical thing. It was a heavy, dense weight in the center of my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I would sit in the armchair by my window, the one they hadn't moved yet, and look out at the old oak tree. I thought of James. Oh, how I missed him. I missed his steady presence, his clear-eyed view of the world. He would have never let it get this far. He would have seen Tiffany for what she was from the moment she walked in the door. He would have taken Marcus aside and spoken to man, and reminded him of his responsibilities, of what it means to honor your family. Tears would stream down my face, hot and silent. They weren't just tears for the present cruelty, but for the loss of the past. The image I held of my son, the sweet boy who was my shadow, had been shattered. In its place was a weak, spineless man who would sell his own mother's comfort for the affection of a younger woman. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult Tiffany could have hurled at me. Her words were just stones. His silence was the poison that carried them into my heart. I'd lie in bed at night and hear them downstairs. Sometimes they would argue, their voices muffled but sharp. Other times I would hear them laughing, a sound that felt like a violation. It was the sound of their life being built directly on top of the ruins of mine. One evening, about a week after the confrontation in the kitchen, I was lying in the dark when I heard their voices rising from the living room directly below my bedroom. The window was open a crack, letting in the cool night air, and their words drifted up with perfect, terrible clarity. "He's already pre-approved for the loan," Tiffany said, her voice excited. "Once we get her into that Golden Vistas place, we can put the house on the market immediately. The realtor said we could easily get 800,000 in this market, maybe more." My blood ran cold. "I don't know, Tiff," Marcus mumbled. "It feels wrong selling my mother's house." "It's not wrong, it's smart," she insisted, her voice hardening. "It's a huge, valuable asset just sitting here. She doesn't need it. We do. With that money, we could put a down payment on a place in the city, a real place, not this museum. We could invest the rest. This is our chance to finally get ahead, Marcus. Don't be weak." Weak, that word again, the one James always used. "She's going to be heartbroken," Marcus said, his voice laced with a pathetic, fleeting guilt. "She'll get over it," Tiffany snapped. "She's 82, she'll be happier with people her own age anyway. We're doing her a favor. Now, are you with me on this or not? Because I'm not waiting around forever to start my life." There was a long pause. I held my breath, my entire being screaming at my son, say no, be a man. For once in your life, be the man your father wanted you to be. "Okay," Marcus finally said, his voice resigned. "Okay, you're right, we'll do it." Something inside me broke, but it wasn't the kind of break that leaves you in pieces on the floor. It was the kind of break that happens when an ice jam on a river finally shatters, unleashing a torrent of furious, unstoppable water. The grief that had been weighing me down for days instantly evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, clarifying rage. They weren't just trying to push me out, they were trying to steal my husband's legacy. They were trying to sell the physical embodiment of my life, the only thing James and I had ever built that was truly ours, to fund their fleeting, shallow desires. The sadness was gone. The hurt was still there, a deep, permanent wound, but it was now surrounded by a wall of cold, hard fury. They thought I was a frail old woman, They saw me as a relic, a bother, a problem to be managed and disposed of. They had forgotten who I was. I was Martha Stewart. I had survived the Great Depression as a child. I had worked alongside my husband to build this house nail by nail. I had raised a child, buried a husband, and managed this household on my own for over a decade. I was not a victim, and I would not be erased. I got out of bed and walked over to the old secretary desk in the corner of my room. It was James's desk. I rarely opened it, but I knew what was inside. I pulled down the roll top, the wood smelling of cedar and old paper. In the back of a small drawer behind a stack of old tax returns was a slim, leather-bound address book. I flipped through the pages until I found the letter L, and there it was. Lang, Patterson, and Chen, attorneys at law. Mr. Lang had been our lawyer for years, a friend of James S. He had passed away, but I knew the firm was still there. Underneath the firm's name was another name, written in James's neat, strong hand. David Chen, a good kid, sharp. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the phone. The despair was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable resolve. They wanted a fight. They had no idea I was about to give them one. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. I put on my good navy blue suit, the one I saved for church and important occasions. I did my hair, applied a touch of lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the weeping ghost who had inhabited this room for the past week. Her eyes were clear and bright with a cold fire. She looked formidable. She looked like her husband's wife. I walked downstairs. Marcus and Tiffany were at the kitchen table, scrolling on their phones over coffee, looking for all the world like the lord and lady of the manor. They looked up in surprise as I entered, a united front of guilt and defensiveness. "Good morning," I said, my voice even and calm. It seemed to startle them. "Ma, you're up early," Marcus said, shifting uncomfortably. "I have an appointment," I stated simply. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my movements deliberate. I did not ask for their permission. I did not explain myself. I simply moved through the space as if it were, once again, entirely my own. Tiffany watched me, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. An appointment with who? I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked her directly in the eye. "That is my business, not yours," I said. Then I turned and walked out the front door, leaving them in a stunned silence. The law office of Lang, Patterson, and Chen was downtown in a modest but respectable building. The confidence I felt walking out of my house began to waver slightly as I rode the elevator up. What if they couldn't help me? What if I really was powerless? But I pushed the doubt away. I remembered James's handwriting, a good kid, sharp. David Chen was not a kid anymore. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a kind face and intelligent eyes that held a hint of his predecessor's seriousness. He greeted me warmly, remembering me from when he was a junior partner helping Mr. Lang with my husband's will. He led me into a comfortable office lined with books and offered me tea. "Mrs. Stewart," he said, his voice gentle. "It's been a long time. I was so sorry to hear about James. He was a fine man. How can I help you?" I took a deep breath and I told him everything. I told him about Marcus losing his job, about my offer to let him stay. I told him about Tiffany's arrival, the takeover of my home, the disrespect. And then, my voice hardening, I told him about the conversation in the kitchen, about being told to find a senior apartment. Finally, I told him what I had overheard, their plan to sell my house. As I spoke, David Chen's expression shifted from polite sympathy to quiet, controlled anger. He listened without interrupting, his hands steepled on his desk. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room. "Mrs. Stewart," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "Martha, what your son and his girlfriend are doing is not just morally reprehensible, it is, in a legal sense, completely untenable. They are guests in your home, they have established tenancy by staying longer than 30 days, but they have no ownership rights whatsoever. This house," he gestured around as if he could see it, "belongs to you and you alone. The deed is in your name, correct?" "And my late husband's," I clarified. "As his sole heir, it is yours, free and clear. They cannot sell it. They cannot force you to leave. They have, in fact, absolutely no power here. You have all of it." Hearing him say it, so plainly and with such authority, was like a cool balm on a burn. I felt the last of the fear and helplessness drain out of me, replaced by a surge of strength. They think I'm a weak old woman, I said, my voice stronger now. They think they can just put me away somewhere and take what's mine. Well, David said with a thin, determined smile, we're about to show them how mistaken they are. He spent the next hour laying out the plan. It was simple, direct, and legally airtight. It wasn't about drama or confrontation, it was about procedure, it was about power. First, he explained, we will serve them with a formal, written notice of eviction. Because they have been living there, they are considered tenants at will. That means you are legally required to give them 30 days' notice to vacate the premises. We will have it delivered by a process server, so there is no question that they have received it. It will be official. They'll laugh at it, I said. They'll think it's a bluff. Let them, David said calmly. The law doesn't care if they laugh. The clock will start ticking the moment they are served. Second, you will do nothing for those 30 days. You will not argue with them. You will not engage with their attempts at manipulation, which I assure you will come. You will be a calm, quiet presence in your own home. Let them spin themselves into a frenzy. And third, on the morning of the 31st day, I will arrange for a locksmith to come and change the locks on all the exterior doors. I will also contact the local sheriff's department and request a civil standby, just to ensure the peace is kept when they discover they can no longer enter the property. He laid it all out so clearly. It was a general strategy for a battle I now knew I could win. What about their things? I asked. You will pack them, he said, neatly, carefully, and you will place them on the front porch. You are not throwing them out, you are making their property available for them to retrieve after their legal right to be inside the house has expired. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. It was so clean, so powerful, so final, it was a plan worthy of James himself. I left David Chen's office feeling taller than I had in years. I had walked in as a victim. I was walking out as a woman with a lawyer and a plan. The rage I felt had been honed into a sharp, precise instrument. I was no longer just sad or angry. I was in control. The net had not been cut. I was the one holding the strings. The process server, a stoic man in a rumpled suit, arrived 2 days later in the early evening. I had been waiting, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest. I opened the door and let him in. Marcus and Tiffany were sprawled on my sofa watching a movie, a bowl of popcorn balanced between them. Marcus Stewart, the server asked, his voice flat and official. Marcus looked up annoyed, yes. The man handed him a crisp, white envelope. You've been served. He then turned to Tiffany. Tiffany Monroe, he handed her an identical envelope. You've been served. And with that, he turned and left. Tiffany tore hers open with a dramatic flourish. Marcus fumbled with his. I stood in the archway of the living room watching them. Tiffany's eyes scanned the document, her brow furrowed in confusion, then amusement. What is this? She scoffed, letting out a short, sharp laugh. A 30-day eviction notice? Is this a joke? She looked over at me, a smirk on her face. Oh, Martha, this is precious. Did you really go to all this trouble? Did you think this would scare us? Marcus looked from the paper to me, his face pale. Ma, what did you do? Why would you do this? It is a legal document, Marcus, I said, my voice as calm and even as the surface of a still pond. It explains itself. You have 30 days to find alternative living arrangements and vacate my property. Tiffany stood up and tossed the notice onto the coffee table. This is ridiculous. You can't evict us. We're family. Marcus is your son. My son is a guest in my home, as are you, I replied, my gaze unwavering. And your visit has come to an end. We're not going anywhere, she spat, her bravado starting to crack, replaced by a raw, petulant anger. You can't make us. The law says I can, I said softly. And then I turned, went to the kitchen, and began to wash the dinner dishes, leaving them to stare at my back. Just as David had predicted, they thought it was a bluff. For the first week, they treated it as a joke, making snide comments about my little legal tantrum. But as the days passed and I remained utterly silent and unmoved on the subject, their amusement began to curdle into anxiety. The manipulation phase began next. Tiffany tried to be sweet. She started making me tea, asking about my day, complimenting my garden. Martha, we got off on the wrong foot, she said one afternoon, her voice syrupy. Let's just tear up those silly papers and go back to how things were. Things will never go back to how they were, I replied without looking up from my book. Then came Marcus's turn. He approached me when I was alone, his face a caricature of sorrow. Ma, you're breaking my heart, he whispered. How can you do this to your own son? After everything I've been through, I have nowhere to go. This was the hardest part. Seeing the pain in his face, even if it was performative, tugged at the old, familiar strings of maternal duty. But then I remembered his silence in the kitchen. I remembered the words, sell the house. The memory was a shield. You are a 54-year-old man, Marcus, I said, my voice devoid of pity. It is time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. Your father would be ashamed of you. The mention of his father struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, and for the first time, I saw real anger flash in his eyes. Don't you bring Dad into this. He is in this, I said. This is his house too, and you will not sell it to fund your girlfriend's lifestyle. The last 2 weeks were a tense, cold war. They alternated between ignoring me completely and having loud, whispered arguments in their room. I went about my days, I weeded my garden, I baked my cakes, I read my books. I was reclaiming my house one quiet moment at a time while they festered within its walls. I began packing their things. I found boxes in the basement, and room by room, I carefully wrapped and stored their belongings. Tiffany's garish cushions, her ugly chrome lamp, her endless collection of shoes. I packed Marcus's clothes, his books, the remnants of his life that he had brought into mine. Each item I placed in a box was an act of liberation. On the 30th day, the house was silent. They had been out all day, and I used the time to move the last of the boxes. There were nearly 40 of them stacked neatly on the covered front porch. The house felt lighter, cleaner. It felt like mine again. I sat in my armchair, the real one, back in its rightful place, and watched the sun set through the branches of the old oak tree. I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound, and necessary peace. The clock had run out. The locksmith arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning as David had arranged. He was a quick, efficient man who understood the situation required discretion. He replaced the locks on the front door, the back door, and the door leading in from the garage. He handed me a set of new, gleaming brass keys. They felt solid and real in my palm. They felt like power. At 10 o'clock, a sheriff's deputy, a calm, professional woman named Officer Riley, arrived. She introduced herself and explained that she was there simply to keep the peace and prevent any breach of conduct. She would not take sides, but she would enforce the law. I offered her a cup of coffee, and we sat in a comfortable silence in the living room, waiting. Just before noon, their car pulled into the driveway. I saw them through the window, laughing about something as they got out. They walked up the path, Tiffany slightly ahead, Marcus trailing behind. She reached the front door and tried to insert her key. It wouldn't go in. She jiggled it, her laughter fading into a frustrated grunt. What's wrong with this stupid lock? She muttered. Marcus tried his key with the same result. A look of dawning horror began to spread across his face. He knocked on the door, a tentative, questioning rap. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the door. I opened it, but only as far as the newly installed security chain would allow. I stood in the narrow opening, a queen in her fortress. Officer Riley stood a few feet behind me, visible but unobtrusive. Their faces, when they saw me, were a study in disbelief. Tiffany's jaw dropped. Marcus looked as if he'd been punched. What is this? Tiffany demanded, her voice rising to a screech. What did you do? The 30 days are over, Tiffany, I said calmly. Your tenancy in this house has expired. You are no longer welcome here. You can't do this. This is insane. Our stuff is in there, she shrieked, pointing wildly. Your belongings have been packed for you, I said, gesturing with my head toward the stacks of boxes on the porch. They are all there. You can take them and go. Marcus finally found his voice. Ma, please, he begged, his eyes welling up with tears. Don't do this. We have nowhere to go. Please, Ma. I looked at my son, at this broken, middle-aged man on my doorstep, and the last vestiges of my anger melted away, leaving only a vast, aching sadness. I am doing this for you, Marcus, I said, and my voice was softer now, tinged with a grief that was all my own. I have been your net for your entire life. I have caught you every time you have fallen, but I see now that in doing so, I have not allowed you to grow a backbone. I have not been helping you. I have been crippling you. This is my home. It is not for sale, and it is not a boarding house. You need to go out into the world and build a life for yourself, not try to take over mine. I looked past him to Tiffany, whose face was a mask of pure fury. As for you, I said, my voice hardening again, you disrespected me and you disrespected my home. You made the grave mistake of thinking that because I am old, I am also weak. You were wrong. Officer Riley took a quiet step forward. Folks, she said, her voice polite but firm, this is a civil matter. The owner of the property has exercised her legal right. I need you to gather your things and leave the premises without any further disturbance. Tiffany looked ready to explode, but the sight of the uniform seemed to drain the fight out of her. Defeated, she turned and began to stare at the mountain of boxes, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on her. Marcus just stood there, tears streaming down his face. I'm your son, he whispered, one last desperate plea. I know, I said, and my own eyes filled with tears. And I will always love my son, but I do not have to live with the man you have become. I closed the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. I could hear them outside, their voices rising and falling as they argued, the sounds of them loading their lives into their car. I stayed there until I heard the car engine start, until I heard it pull away, until the only sound left was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the beating of my own heart. The house was silent, but this was a new kind of silence. It was not the lonely silence of grief, nor the tense silence of a cold war. It was a clean, whole, and peaceful silence. It was the sound of order restored. It was the sound of my home. I walked through the rooms of my house, touching the furniture, breathing in the familiar air, now clean and untainted. I had won. But it was a victory that came at a great cost. I had to evict my own son to save myself. I learned the hardest lesson of my long life in these past few weeks. Sometimes the most profound act of love is to let go, not just of the person they are, but of the person you wanted them to be. And you have to learn to love yourself enough to draw a line in the sand, even if it means standing on the other side of it all alone. A legacy isn't just a house you leave behind. It's the strength you find within yourself to protect it.